Gem Harvest, the most recent episode of Steven Universe, and the show's second 22-minute special, which I really hope means that we should expect to get more 22-minute specials down the line. Because as I'm sure a lot of you guys know, I really do feel like the pacing of the show would be better at 22 minutes. This episode really was not what I expected. It was significantly better than what I expected. And that's not to say that I wasn't expecting a lot, because I was. When Steven goes to the barn to spend some time with Lapis and Peridot, he is not only surprised to see that they've begun farming at the barn, seemingly to try to grow sentient plants, because I guess they haven't realized yet that plants aren't sentient, or even autonomous. They're not even autonomous. Basically, they haven't figured out yet that plants are inanimate objects. And at the very least, Peridot misses home and misses doing work for Homeworld, bringing new gems into existence, and is hoping to recapture some of that by growing plants. And that's something that I can certainly understand. Lapis is helping her out. She's using her water powers again, kind of to irrigate the fields, I guess, which is a huge step up for her because she was really traumatized by water for a while there, if you guys don't remember. And things seem like they're just going to be a cutesy episode between Steven, Lapis, and Peridot with the little pumpkin dog friend that Steven made using his powers. But nope. The episode drops something completely unexpected on us. A relative of Greg's literally flies onto the scene in an old plane. It would seem that he's inherited the barn. It belongs to him. And as far as he knew, no one was using it, let alone anyone who had permission from his family. And while that in and of itself isn't entirely unexpected, I could see that happening at some point eventually down the line. It's the way that this guy was characterized that really got to me. Now I want to make it clear, I don't like the guy. Still, even now, after having seen the entire episode, I don't like him as a person. I don't really dislike him as much either. I have an open mind about him, but he's not someone I'd invite to lunch, let's put it that way. But as a character, he's great. He shows up and he immediately demands to know what's going on. Eventually, Greg and the other gems all get involved, and Steven basically keeps the peace between this guy and his entire extended family and helps them to reach common ground and find an understanding. It's the kind of thing that Steven does. That, again, is not unexpected. What was really unexpected about this guy is that he's a bigot. He's the first human bigot that we've seen in Steven Universe. And I know I seem really excited by that, and I'm not excited by bigotry. I'm excited that they brought a character like this into the show. Not because I think bigots should exist, even in fiction, but because they brought in this character who is clearly a bigoted person, who clearly makes generalized, blanket, stereotypical statements about entire groups of people, but who is also not written as a straw man. He has severe faults, don't get me wrong, but he, at several points throughout the course of this episode, completely reevaluates the way he thinks. When he is faced with evidence that he might be wrong, he reevaluates. And while the episode does almost end with him realizing that he was wrong and then running off so he doesn't have to face it, which is something that bigoted people do a lot, Steven is able to convince him to come back because this guy does care about family and maintaining relationships with family. And Steven is his family. In fact, we see that the majority of the times that he reevaluates himself is when he feels comfortable, and that's when he's talking to his family. I don't think that everyone can be reasoned with. I think that's actually one of the main problems that Steven Universe has overall, because it does have a few. And I definitely think that's probably the biggest one, that Steven Universe seems to be spreading the message that everyone can be reasoned with, that everyone can be compromised with, and that's just not true. But when we're dealing with the bigotry between gems, between these aliens who are very different than humans, whose relationships aren't really analogous to human relationships, I feel like some of the message of discussion and compromise and reason gets lost, because they aren't human. We can't relate to them as much as we can to a regular person. Then this cousin Andy comes in, and he is a human being, and he's saying the same kind of things that your slightly racist uncle or grandfather might be saying, or your slightly bigoted aunt or grandma might be saying. And we get to see the same kind of reasoning that works on gems work on this person to help bring him around and change his perspective to one that is objectively better. Because by the end of the episode, he admits that he was wrong to so quickly label the gems as freeloaders and despots and whatever else he implied that they might be, and he lets them stay at the barn. I wouldn't say he's come around completely, I wouldn't say he's given up his bigoted ways entirely, but that's huge progress. It would have been so easy to turn him into a straw man, kind of the way that Marty was basically a straw man. And I'll tell you right off the bat that it takes so much less talent to write a straw man, and so much more work to avoid it, and the crew put in that work and made this character someone who I will never agree with, should their views persist as they are today, but who I could definitely see being someone who comes around. and someone who has legitimate complaints. Yes, it was unfair of him to generalize and to stereotype Lapis and Peridot the way that he did, to cast blanket statements over them, rather than get to know them as people, as individual people. And it was unfair to try to kick them out of the barn specifically because of those blanket statements that he had cast over them. But at the end of the day, if he had gotten to know them and he'd still decided that he didn't want them living at his barn, it's still his barn. Should his opinion change? If he's not using the barn, should he let someone else use it who needs it? Yes, probably. But it's still his right to say no. It's his barn. And while it's still very likely that he only let them use the barn because his family knew them and trusted them, that it wasn't because he had genuinely come around to them as people, or even come to appreciate them as people, that's still a gesture that I never could have seen this character making at the start of the episode. And what makes the writing here even more impressive is that the gems weren't immediately put up on a pedestal either. Andy wasn't made a straw man, but the gems weren't portrayed as being perfect. Pearl's statement that their Greg is clearly superior to this new Greg from relatively early in the episode was funny, objectively funny, but it was also very telling. Pearl, like we have seen her do many times with humans, made a snap judgment that she was never going to come to a reasonable compromise with this human, that she was never going to come to an understanding with this human, and so intended to cast him aside as not worth her time. And just as it was Steven who got Andy to listen to the gems and get to know the gems and come to understand the gems' perspective, Steven also brought Pearl to the table and got her talking with Andy and inspired a greater understanding in her. Again, I reiterate, I don't think that any of the bigoted stuff that Andy said was right, but it's important to remember that even if we hate the views of others, that those views don't inherently make up everything that that person is, and that we will only grow as a society if we come to an understanding and then use that as a foundation to change people for the better. Casting blanket statements over entire groups of people is harmful going either way. Every individual, while they might share the majority of their opinions with others, have a unique perspective, a unique experience, and it is unfair to judge them based only on what we can perceive looking in. I'm even going to go so far as to say that that's where racism comes from, an unwillingness to judge people for anything other than what you can see looking in. And I am so happy that the writers chose to use this episode to convey the message of how important it is for people with different views to come together, especially in the times that we're living in today. And that isn't even all that there is to talk about regarding this episode. There were some fantastic moments in here that weren't specifically tied to this narrative. They came about because of it, but they were independent of it at the same time. We get to see the gems joking about the rebellion and about the war, and Lapis making kind of a self-deprecating joke about the fact that she was put in the mirror, but still finding humor in it, or at least doing her best to find humor in it, showing how far all of these characters have come. There was some great cuteness with the pumpkin dog. There was some good humor, especially when Pearl brought out a wedding cake with a bunch of different figurines to represent all of them together, which, you know, just had to be a stab at all the shippers who've been fighting over which ship is better, instead of just appreciating all of the relationships that the show offers. Not only that, but we get a couple of instances where we really get to see how Steven has improved, which powers he's begun to get a handle on and which ones he hasn't, and which ones he's trying to get a handle on and can't, and just gave us a better understanding of where exactly he is in his personal journey to improve as a gem, without neglecting his human side, because we have seen a couple of times, I think most obviously probably at the very end of We Need to Talk, that Steven feels bad for neglecting his human side, for neglecting growth of his human side. And it is very heavily implied by an exchange between Steven and Andy that he intends to start exploring his human side more, which is in part why this episode is definitely not filler, as some people are saying. The ongoing Crystal Gems versus Homeworld plot is not the only ongoing story arc in this show, and this episode does address several of the other minor arcs, as well as introducing a character that you can't just lift out of this series without his absence leaving an impact. Andy made an impact on these characters that is going to last past the end of this episode. So just because you didn't like Andy, you didn't like that a character like Andy was included in the show, or you didn't personally feel like enough happened here, that you weren't satisfied by what happened in this episode, that doesn't make it filler. I loved this episode. I thought it was fantastic. I definitely thought it was deserving of being a Thanksgiving special, despite the fact that the characters in-universe don't know what Thanksgiving is, even though they're practicing Thanksgiving traditions right there in front of us. It was actually quite funny. It was bold, it was emotional, it was thought-provoking, but it was also cute and funny and furthered the story. I would call this episode an absolute success. But, of course, I ask, guys, what do you think of this episode? Let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.
You're telling me Universe isn't a real last name? Mayo's a much cooler name than plain old Universe.